Why would King David, a man after God's own heart, order the death of one of his most loyal warriors? Not in battle, but in secret. What would drive Israel's greatest king to betrayal? And what was the cost, not just to him, but to the soul of a nation? Stay with me till the end, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about David Bathsheba and the devastating cost of hidden sin. Welcome to Bible Stories. If you're passionate about true biblical accounts that reveal deep truths, powerful life lessons, and raw human drama, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video to help spread the word. This is not a fairy tale. It's a story of honor and betrayal, of passion and pride, of a faithful warrior and a king who fell. He was loyal, brave, faithful to his king, and his king repaid him with death. His name was Uriah the Hittite, a man whose legacy was nearly buried by a royal cover-up until heaven brought it to light. This is the untold tragedy of Uriah, and one of the most shocking betrayals in all of Scripture. It was the golden age of Israel, around 1000 BC. King David sat on the throne, victorious in battle, revered by his people, and chosen by God himself. Under his rule, the kingdom of Israel expanded. Enemies were defeated. The Ark of the Covenant had returned to Jerusalem. David's name carried weight across nations. But even in times of success, darkness can find its way in. The armies of Israel were locked in a fierce siege against the Ammonites at a city called Rabbah. This was the season when kings led their men to war. Yet David stayed behind, alone in Jerusalem, and while his soldiers risked their lives at the front lines, David's eyes were about to fall on something that would change everything. Before he became the victim of royal betrayal, Uriah was a warrior, a Hittite by origin, a foreigner by blood, but a brother in faith, fully devoted to the God of Israel. What kind of man leaves his homeland to fight for a kingdom not his own? What kind of soul lays down his life for a cause he could have walked away from? Uriah wasn't just any soldier. He was one of the mighty men of David, a hand-picked band of elites known simply as the 30. These weren't ordinary warriors. These were legends, men who killed lions in snowy pits, who faced giants, who stood their ground when entire armies turned and ran. And Uriah earned his place, not by noble birth, but by unbreakable courage. He fought for something more than himself, something eternal. Loyal to his nation, loyal to his king, and above all, loyal to his wife. He was the kind of man who would carry out any command without hesitation, even if it led him straight into the jaws of death. But what happens when loyalty is weaponized? What happens when the person you trust most, the one you die to protect, becomes the one who plots your end? In a time of war and glory, Uriah stood as a symbol of unshakable honor. He didn't fight for applause. He didn't fight for riches. He fought for duty, for covenant, for a God he believed in. But somewhere inside the palace walls, temptation was stirring, desire was growing, and secrets were forming. Even as Uriah bled on foreign soil for his king, that same king was preparing to take the one thing Uriah held most dear. Could he have sensed the danger? Could he feel the shifting winds of betrayal behind royal smiles and sudden favors? Or was he simply too righteous to imagine that a man like David could fall so far? Soon this loyal warrior would be caught in a web of desire, deception, and betrayal so dark, it would stain the pages of Israel's history and break the heart of God himself. But while Uriah fought with honor on the battlefield, back in Jerusalem, a battle far more dangerous was just beginning. A silent war, waged not with swords, but with sight. And the first weapon was a glance from a rooftop. What happens when a king forgets the God who placed the crown on his head? What happens when a moment of desire goes unchecked and becomes a trap? The days were warm in Jerusalem, but beneath the calm, something darker was brewing. Far off in Rabbah, the clash of swords echoed. Israel's warriors bled for their king. But within the palace walls, where no blades were drawn and no cries for help rang out, a different kind of war was being waged. And this one would be fought in silence. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows crept across the rooftops, King David rose from his bed. He stepped onto the rooftop of his palace, his eyes sweeping across the city below. Then he saw her. Her name was Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. She did not know the king was watching, but he was. Did David pause to consider the cost? Did he feel the Spirit tug at his conscience? Or had the power he once used to serve now begun to serve himself? In that moment, desire eclipsed wisdom. Power drowned out conviction. David had many wives, yet he sent messengers, not to inquire, not to wait, but to take. This was not love. This was lust, cloaked in royal silence. And David sent messengers, and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her, and she returned unto her house. No alarms were sounded, no one spoke out. The king returned to his chambers, Bathsheba returned to hers. The night passed, the sin was buried, and life seemed to go on. But sin doesn't stay buried forever. It waits, and then it speaks. Weeks later, a quiet message was delivered to the palace. Just 3 words, but they fell like thunder. And the woman conceived, and sent and told David, and said, I am with child. Now, the king had a problem. Not a threat from the battlefield, not an uprising in the streets, but something more dangerous than any enemy. A scandal. What would happen if this came to light? What would the people say? What would God do? David could have confessed, could have repented, but instead, he began to plot. The same man who once wrote Psalms of righteousness began spinning a web of deception. What are we capable of when we try to protect a lie instead of facing the truth? The man who once slew giants was now preparing to destroy one of his own, not with a sword, not with an army, but with secrecy and silence and pride. The message from Bathsheba struck like a thunderclap in a cloudless sky. I am with child. 3 words, but they shook the palace walls more violently than any invading army ever could. And just like that, the mighty king of Israel, once the shepherd boy who sang songs to God, the warrior who brought down Goliath, now stood at the edge of a scandal that could shatter everything. David had faced lions, giants, foreign kings, but now he faced something more dangerous. The consequences of his own sin. What do you do when you are the threat, when the enemy is inside your own heart? Instead of falling on his knees, David chose to build a mask, a cover-up, a story, a lie. The plan seemed foolproof. Bring Uriah back. Let him go home to his wife. Let nature and timing take care of the rest. If Uriah believed the child was his, then the secret would die in silence. 2 Samuel 11:6. And David sent to Joab, saying, Send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. From the dust and heat of the battlefield, Uriah returned. Maybe he thought it was an honor, a promotion, a personal word from the king. He had no idea. He was walking into a trap designed by the very man he trusted with his life. David welcomed him with smiles, with questions, with all the warmth of a king and all the coldness of a liar. He asked about Joab, the war, the morale of the troops. But beneath the noble words was a hidden motive. And David said to Uriah, Go down to thy house and wash thy feet. A phrase of comfort, a command dressed in kindness. And to make it easier, David even sent a gift after him. But Uriah didn't go. He didn't step into his house, didn't embrace his wife, didn't take the bait. Instead, he slept at the entrance of the palace, on the hard ground, beside the king's servants. 2 Samuel 11:9. David was shaken. The plan was falling apart. The simplicity of the cover-up had just met the complexity of character. Why didn't Uriah go home? Why would a man refuse comfort after war? What kind of man resists temptation when it's served on a royal platter? 2 Samuel 11:11. And Uriah said unto David, The ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my Lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go into mine house to eat and to drink, and to lie with my wife? As thou livest, I will not do this thing. And there it was, a warrior's code, a man's honor, truth, standing unshaken in the presence of deceit. Uriah refused comfort because his brothers were still in battle. He refused pleasure because the ark of God still dwelled in tents. He refused manipulation, even when it came from a king. The light of Uriah's integrity exposed the shadows in David's heart, and in that moment, David had a choice: confess or conceal, come clean or go darker. And David chose darkness. What happens when the king anointed by God decides to keep his crown clean, even if it means spilling innocent blood? What happens when sin is no longer an accident, but a strategy? The next step would make David's fall complete. The walls were closing in on David. His attempts to manipulate Uriah had failed. The soldier's honor was too great, and the evidence of David's sin was growing inside Bathsheba's womb. And so, the king made a decision, one that would forever stain his legacy. David, the once humble shepherd who spared King Saul in a cave, now sharpened the blade of betrayal against a faithful servant. 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 14 says, "And it came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah." Yes, you heard that right. The letter was carried by Uriah himself, a scroll sealed with royal authority containing his own death sentence. The letter read, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die." Joab, commander of the army, received the message and obeyed, without hesitation, without question. Soon Uriah returned to the battlefield, not knowing that the orders for his death had been delivered by his own loyal hand. Joab watched for the right moment, when the fighting was fiercest, when the risk was highest. Then he placed Uriah at the front lines and quietly withdrew support. And the men of the city went out and fought with Joab, and there fell some of the people of the servants of David, and Uriah the Hittite died also. Uriah didn't fall back. He didn't run. He fought like the warrior he was until the final blow struck him down. And just like that, a righteous man was murdered, not by enemy hands, but by the very king he served. No trial, no justice, just silence, and a battlefield soaked with innocent blood. The cover-up was complete, at least for a moment. The news traveled slowly, like a shadow creeping across the city. But when it arrived, it struck like a dagger to the heart. Uriah the Hittite was dead. Killed in battle, they said. Just another casualty in a war far from home. But Bathsheba knew better. She may not have known the details, the orders, the scheme behind the sword, but her soul could feel what the words would never say. Her husband was not simply lost in war. He was taken. This was not political grief, not rehearsed sorrow, not staged mourning for the eyes of the court. This was heartbreak, raw, personal, real. She had lost more than a husband. She had lost the one man who still walked in honor, while a king hid behind shadows. And for a while Jerusalem wept with her. Mourning cloths were worn, lamps burned low, the city hushed. But then, the days of mourning ended, and David moved, fast. 2 Samuel 11:27. And when the mourning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife, and bare him a son. Bathsheba became queen. The scandal disappeared beneath royal silks and wedding veils. The child was born. Life moved on. The whispers died down. It seemed the king's plan had worked. But here's the question no one dared to ask. What happens when a throne is built on a grave? What happens when a man silences his guilt, but heaven does not? Because while men look on the outside, God sees the heart, and though the palace halls were quiet, the throne room of heaven was not. God had watched it all, the rooftop glance, the midnight summons, the morning silence, the sealed orders, the blood-soaked betrayal. Nothing had been hidden. 2 Samuel 11:27. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Now ask yourself, what does it mean when the Lord is displeased and you're the king? What happens when the God of heaven says enough? Justice was coming, but not through war, not through plague, not through fire. It would come through a man, a prophet, a voice of truth, sent to stand before a king. His name was Nathan, and he carried more than a message. He carried the word of the Lord, and when God speaks, no crown can silence him. The palace had gone quiet, the wedding had passed, a child had been born. To the world it looked like King David had moved on, but the throne of heaven had not. And so God sent a man, a prophet, a voice of righteousness. His name was Nathan. Nathan entered David's court not with accusation, but with a story, a parable. 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse. And he came unto him and said unto him, there were two men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. David listened as the prophet spoke. The rich man had many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing, only one little lamb. The lamb grew up with him and his children. It ate from his plate, drank from his cup, slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. But one day a traveler came to the rich man, and rather than take from his own herd, the rich man stole the poor man's lamb. He slaughtered it and served it to his guest. David's fury ignited like fire, and David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, as the Lord liveth, the man that hath done this thing shall surely die. Then the room went still. Nathan's eyes didn't flinch. His voice didn't waver. And Nathan said to David, thou art the man. You are the rich man who took what was not his. You had everything, and yet you stole the one thing your servant held dear. David's face drained of color. The weight of his sin crashed down like thunder. This was no longer a secret. This was no longer hidden. The king of Israel had been exposed before the king of heaven. This is one of the most sobering stories in all of Scripture. A tale soaked in power, temptation, betrayal, and innocent blood. But make no mistake, this story isn't just about David. And it's not only about Bathsheba. It's also about a man whose name the world tried to forget, but heaven never did. Uriah the Hittite. 2 Samuel 23:39. Uriah the Hittite, one of David's mighty men. Even after everything, after betrayal, after the cover-up, David still remembered his name among the elite. Why? Because Uriah was more than a soldier, more than a casualty. He was a standard. In a world of compromise, he was a man who didn't bend. While a king fell into desire, Uriah stood in discipline. While a royal heart turned cold, his burned with loyalty. He died on a battlefield where he never should have been, because of a lie he never knew existed. But even in death, his character speaks louder than the sword that struck him. What kind of man chooses duty over comfort? What kind of man says no to pleasure when no one is watching? What kind of man keeps his oath, even when it costs him everything? That was Uriah, and heaven still whispers his name. But what about David, a man after God's own heart, who still fell into darkness? He sinned deeply, deliberately, and lives were shattered in the fallout. But here's where the story turns. David didn't just fall, he broke. And when he broke, he repented. David would face the consequences: a child lost, a household in chaos, a throne shaken. His crown would remain, but his peace would not, because sin always costs something. And yet, in the ashes of judgment, mercy still breathed. God did not abandon David, because God doesn't just write stories of justice, he writes stories of redemption. And that's where the real question comes in. When no one's watching, who are you? When power tempts you, when shortcuts whisper, when secrecy seems safer than the truth, Will you stand like Uriah, or will you fall like David? And if you've already fallen, if shame has stained your story, know this: the same God who judged David also forgave him. God's mercy still reaches that low, and his grace still lifts that high. This isn't just a story from long ago. It's a mirror, a warning, and an invitation to live with integrity, to walk in the light, and when we stumble, to return to the one who still calls us his. He carried his own death sentence, sealed in the king's hand. He never questioned, never hesitated. Uriah marched with honor into betrayal. And yet, his name echoes in eternity. What about you? Have you ever stood firm when no one was watching? Stayed loyal when no one stood with you? Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted most? Tell us in the comments below, what part of Uriah's story struck you the deepest? Because this isn't just history, this is humanity, and God still sees the faithful. If you felt the weight of this story, like, share, and subscribe. And don't miss what's coming next. See you in the next story.